Hello, folks. My name is Robert Kaushenga, and I am the bad native from Kampala. On a morning when we've received some really sad news of the passing of one of Africa's greatest sons, Raila Amolo Odinga. And first, I'll let the other bad natives introduce themselves. We've got our man in Nairobi. Go ahead.
Yes, your man in Nairobi is Charles Onyango Obo.
And I'm Adesua Giwa Osage, coming to you from Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt today.
Adesua, let me stay with you on this. And while you guys are out there listening, so just so you know, this is also going out live on our other platforms, and people are listening, especially the audios. Adesua, before we could, we had planned that this was going to be one of our recorded ones. And then
Mm.
you dropped the bombshell about what had happened or the stories that you were hearing. I mean, the last I had heard from the issue of Raila Odinga is there were questions on social media asking, where is Baba, as he is
Mm.
referred to in Kenya. So, what is the news saying exactly?
Well, right now, reports indicate that Raila Odinga, at age 80, has passed away in a hospital in India. There were rumors about his health. Recently, as you said, people were asking for Baba, as he is well known. He was the Kenyan Prime Minister from 2008 to 2013, and he unsuccessfully ran for president of Kenya 5 times, although every time he did say that there was electoral malpractice. And in 2017, the courts actually agreed with him and ordered a rerun. However, he boycotted that rerun. Raila Odinga was also ran for the presidency of the AU, the Africa Union, last year and this year. And I was actually supported by Ruto, who is someone he had run against also for president. So the reports indicate that he was in India, that he was on a walk in Kochi, and he suffered a cardiac arrest on that walk, and that he's currently in the hospital there, as we're waiting for official response from the Kenyan government. But it's being reported by local news in India and by some international news organizations that at age 80, the former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Odinga has passed.
Charles,
Yeah.
what is the media saying in Kenya?
Well, you see, the news started coming out earlier, but if you notice, most of the mainstream media play it safe because in the last month there have been two reports of
Mm,
of his possible passing. So I think that a lot of them were waiting to hear an official word from the family of government. In the last month, and that hasn't come. That yet hasn't
mhm.
come. But I mean, when we talk to our sources who are good on this, they seem to suggest that that likely happened because they officially confirmed that he had had a procedure, and now
Mm,
says it was I think some surgery to the somewhere in the head, and that he was in
mm,
recovery and he had been exercising in his, and he was on one of those exercises, his walking exercises, when he passed. So that is the state of play. I can't. I think I the I think the responsible thing to say would be to say we'll wait, as Adeswa said, for the confirmation from the family or the government directly. But that having been said, he was
mm.
Raila. I think is everything else aside. I think he's one of been the most consequential opposition leader in Kenya of the last 25 years. And
Would you say, Charles, wait a minute, are you consequential opposition leader or consequential leader?
No, no, no. I'll come.
Amen.
I'll come to that.
Okay. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but uh, but also in in that sense, they're saying he is also the most consequential leader because there is a saying in Kenya that if you want to know someone's power is their ability to shut down a main highway or the city. Raila is the only person
Mm,
uh, who
mm,
is not, who could shut down the city and shut down all of the arteries in and out of Nairobi if he made the call for his
yeah.
supporters to come out. So,
Mm.
and there is this argument that Raila really didn't need to be president because in many
Yeah.
ways he already was. Eh?
Yeah. I mean,
But
he ran.
yeah, and but I think that then if we talk in African terms, he represented.
Mm,
If you think of it, he's the last generation of kind of those leftist leaders who grew up in the who were formed in the 60s and started their politics and activism in the 70s. Right now,
mm,
you are looking in terms of those who were active. It was basically him and Museveni.
mm, mm,
One of the
mm,
last in East Africa was Ben Mkapa, people like that, and
mm,
you have the kind of the last tail of this generation in South Africa, but most of them have gone, the Oliver Tambos and all that. So that is why in Africa that was his capital because he was really okay. He's a bit of a transactional politician. There is no doubt about it. but uh, but
True.
but
How
uh,
many
but really, in
handshakes
that
did he
sense,
have?
he was one of the last Pan-Africanist and progressive leftist politician of that generation standing.
Mm.
Talking about his Pan African credentials, I don't know if you know this, Adesua, but he had very, very strong connections at very high levels in Nigeria.
Mm.
And I think he was a personal friend of Obasanjo. Again, Obasanjo's name comes up. So, how did you guys in Nigeria in particular, but people of your generation, how did you view uh, Raila? And do you know anything that could help us understand how he linked up with the Nigerian establishment and established such close and very powerful links?
I'm not very close on the specifics with how he linked up with the Nigerian establishment, but Raila and Obasanjo have certain things in common, particularly because I believe Raila was the longest serving detainee in Kenyan prisons, going against the military regime. If we remember, there was also a period where Obasanjo was detained, particularly under Abacha's regime here in Nigeria, where he was, this fight for democracy that they all have, and they come from similar generations. And if we look at Raila, we also actually have to look at Kenyatta, and we have to look at the post colonial leaders in Anglophone West Africa, because there has been a bond, I would say, in that the former British colonies found themselves bonding, the leaders of those countries found themselves bonding in that post-colonial era, as you said, that post-1960 world order, as we were seeing when we had some of our pre-colonial leaders going to the United Kingdom for the constitutional conferences. They were meeting each other there. Some of them went to school together. We've spoken about even Mbeki coming to Nigeria. I think that the Anglophone former British colonies, that our leadership formed some type of network. Obviously, language helps, but also that identity of being at the helm of the birth of a new nation, and then also having to deal with the type of autocratic leadership that they faced right after colonialism, I think you will see similarities there with Obasanjo and with Raila. So he does represent, as you said, kind of, or as Charles said, rather, like the last of a certain generation, right? It's like a link to our past. Someone like a Raila Odinga, because he has his life has kind of covered some very huge transitions on the continent, right? And so I think when we're dealing with his legacy in Kenya, on the continent, as somebody who just tried to head the AU, we also see that, you know, it's going to be something that we'll be grappling with, I think, for the next couple of days.
Charles, Raila was a child, or I think the word is scion, of, yeah, yeah, a scion of a family with a very strong and powerful political tradition. Just so we anchor Raila the man into the minds of many Africans, particularly those young ones who only may have known him recently. Who was Raila and what kind of family? Where does he come from? Who was this guy?
Raila comes from the the great political families of Kenya, and
Mm,
and and one of it is dynasties, no question. Um,
yeah.
his father was Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who was
Mm,
an independence fighter on the left.
mm,
You know, he was a
mm,
leftist, and
mm.
but really here is the thing that um, really marked Jaramogi's father out. He Jomo Kenyatta and other people were detained.
Yes.
And so, as independence approached, they were still in
Mm,
detention. So,
mm.
the, the British proposed to move forward with independence with Raila Odinga as the prime minister. And
No, Ogingo Dinga.
yes, sorry, you know, Gingo Odinga's father as prime minister. And he refused. he
Mm.
said,
Yes.
he said, I cannot take up this job and there'll be no independence as long as Jomo Kenyatta and his group of colleagues were in prison. So he gave up the job, and Jomo Kenyatta was released, and Kenya became independent, and he was appointed the first deputy president. So I mean that is
Mhm.
really, really, uh, you know, remarkable for an African politician.
Hmm.
So that is the tradition from which Raila comes. I think he himself has probably never achieved the level of being so principled as his father. But
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 you know,
but 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 I guess that is the cross he had to carry, and that is the shadow that he lived under.
But
mm,
so for just for Adesua's information, you see his Pan-Africanist credentials, by the way, don't end, so interestingly, he one of the things that I think represents Raila was he had a very, very interesting ability to build networks, which I think is something he learned from his father.
yes.
So one of the networks, most enduring networks that he built was the network in Tanzania. Now, when I first hear of Raila Odinga, it is actually in 1982. Ask me what happened in 1982, Raila. I'm
What
sure
happened in the
you were not yet
1982?
born.
I definitely was not yet born, but I think Buhari was already planning his coup, his first
Yeah,
time
Shehu
around.
Shagari. So Shehu
Yeah.
Shagari was still president of Nigeria, but
Yes.
Raila was involved in a military coup plot to try and remove Moi, which is the
Mm.
reason he was detained for that long. So that's when he explodes onto the political scene in his own right. And I think, Charles,
mm,
Yeah.
I dare say that, you see, Raila is that one politician from a political dynasty who was not anointed,
Yeah. Yeah.
but in
Yeah.
fact, he just followed the family tradition of opposition politics, of being dangerously, almost recklessly bold. And but he also had incredible ways of taking steps. That so, for instance, it was unimaginable in 1982, the Kenya of 1982, strong connections with the British and the Americans, and
mm.
Raila, who was a engineer trained in East Germany then, so that means he was a communist, tried tried to carry out a coup. And then for that, he was detained for 6 years.
Mm,
Um, and then he comes out, and Charles, this is another story that you should tell Adesua. How then he is accused of trying to set up a guerrilla outfit and has to escape through Uganda.
Yeah.
Do you remember that time in the late 80s?
Yeah.
Now he's been released from jail. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah. Yes. Because there was then because and just remember to go back at that time there were
Mm,
just 4 countries in Africa which had the
mm,
semblance of open economies. Kenya,
yes.
or those days, let us call them capitalist. Kenya,
Hmm.
Malawi, and Kamuzu Banda,
Mm,
apartheid, South Africa, and Botswana.
mm.
Mhm.
Even elements of Nigeria still retained the under Shagari and just before the soldiers come back.
Yeah. Now, so there was then a broad leftist and radical movement. I think that the most famous of them was called Mwakenya. And
Mm,
but which was really more, properly speaking, an umbrella organization. So Raila was seen as part of that, and then of
mm,
course they chase him. He goes out, but he didn't stay out for long, and then comes back in. But I think, Robert, it is important that it's at that point that we actually begin to see his transition from
okay.
being a more leftist leader to being either a kind of a more centric or social democratic leader, and and it is also at the point at which his political brand really grows considerably.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm.
but Bob, I mean, you talk of his escaping through Uganda. Huh? Just there is this very
You
Right
have to
on
corner
neighbors
me,
at
Charles.
home.
Bob, there were so many things we did with the Kenyans escaping. I don't want to, because I was involved in running a safe house for the Kenyans who were,
You were involved in running a safe house?
yeah, for
A safe
Kenyans who were
house.
fleeing. Yeah. But
Yeah.
speak to us
Yeah.
about that, Bob, because one of the things you see, so there is this
Mm,
line, because within East Africa itself, um,
mm,
the what is the nature of Museveni's relationship with Raila? Because it's a very interesting one. It's ideologically they are aligned, but in terms of regional geopolitics, they are not aligned. Museveni has never supported him politically. He's probably, I mean, clearly, every time a favor, his rival. But yet, on other left issues, and particularly like Sudan, South Sudan, they have been bosom allies, and they are all this. There is this very strange love-hate relationship. What what what's going on there?
So, I'm actually going to flip your question and say, what was the nature of Raila's relationships with Uganda? Because he had like three different relationships with Uganda. So interestingly, so first of all, you ask, the whole dynamic with Museveni. You see, they are exactly alike. And I don't see how a Museveni could have been the president of Kenya and another Museveni is the president of Uganda. East Africa would have been completely dysfunctional. They would both of them. There's no way a Raila presidency and the Museveni presidency in would have coexisted. They were just they were so they're the same type of individual. And at the sort, I don't know if this happens in uh, West Africa, but uh, in East Africa, there's always been a senior leader who sort of is the regional, what do they call it? Primus.
The regional head, the big Don Daddy,
That
chief.
is the guarantor of like the region. So there was always a rivalry between uh, Nyerere and Kenyatta
Yeah.
in the
Mm.
70s, 60s and 70s. And then Kenyatta died, and then Nyerere came in as the undisputed regional leader. So people
Mm.
sort of now,
And then we had
so in
Moi,
a
of course.
sense, that of course, yes, Moi first defected from Nyerere, then he came back, and after the peace talks of 19. So part of the problem was that soon after, Moi, I think, always felt that Museveni, by refusing to honor the 1985 peace agreement, had sort of betrayed him. And he felt or always accused Kampala of trying to undermine his government by supporting leftist rebels. And that's how Raila then escapes because he was going to be arrested again. And then Uganda facilitates his escape from Kenya and through Uganda off to Norway. That I remember caused a massive diplomatic tiff between Uganda and Kenya.
Mm.
But Raila had two other very interesting relationships. One of Raila's closest Ugandan allies is a man called Honorable Mike Mukula, who is as far away from a leftist as the North Pole is far from the South. I mean, Mike Mukula is a deal maker. He's just a businessman. That's it. That's what Mike does. He's in politics, yes, but for him, politics is an extension of his business interests. So I think that sort of Mike represented uh, Raila's business interests in Uganda. Then Raila is one of the best friends of the Kabaka of Buganda. It is the strangest of relationships. But every time Raila came to Uganda, he paid a visit to the Kabaka as a personal visitor, and vice versa.
Kabaka.
The Kabaka is a bit like the who is that very
Kind of an
senior
Asante
cultural
Hene,
leader?
kind of. Eh?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So like, okay, like Emir of
Oh,
Kano,
yes. Yeah.
exactly,
Sultan
Yeah.
of Sokoto.
exactly. That
Okay.
status, that status.
Okay.
But you see, if you look at his politics and the politics of, and it's a relationship. I mean, the Kabaka and his family have a long tradition of being to the right of any politics. So you would wonder where.
That's not strange to me. I think that's not strange to me at all. I think rich African men have always been able to align with each other based on personality easier than they have based on ideology. And I think the reason it's strange to you is because you guys still have some semblance of ideology in your politics. In Nigeria, yesterday the ruling party just got a super majority, but like the House of Reps lost a lot of members to the ruling party. A sitting governor just moved to the ruling party. And if you're asking how can people change parties like they change underwear, it's because there's no ideology, you know. So there is
Okay,
class, what they call class solidarity amongst rich African men goes a long way.
which takes me neatly to one perhaps of the most consequential transactional relationships that Raila Odinga pulled off, and it took Kenya in a completely different direction. Charles, talk us through how Raila joins Moi, who had been detaining him, and then he goes into Kano and breaks
Yeah.
Moi's. So, do you want to talk? That was, I think, one of his most powerful
Yeah.
moments in the politics of East Africa.
Because Moi had been an adversary, at that time he was president of Kenya. But then the multi-party movement started. It gained steam. And Moi was now very, very weak and threatened. So he desperately needed, a rebalancing. And he needed a strong, one of the icons of the opposition movement. And Raila is very, very good at, at reading those kind of opportunities. So he goes in and joins, KANU, the ruling party. And just his joining alone already splits the party in two. eh? And
Mm,
then and then Moi tries to re-engineer the party to accommodate him.
mm.
And Raila then ditches Moi.
Yeah, publicly,
And
by the way.
yeah, he ditches him and he takes basically no so there are there are certain figures in the party who are looking to be successors to take over the party to
Mm,
become secretary general. So Moi throws them under the bus,
mm,
in order to accommodate Raila. And after he had been this accommodated, Raila ditches him. So he leaves Moi very, very weak. His party is already
mhm,
split. And at that point, the Kenya's transition back to a multi-party democracy became inevitable. And
mm,
and he did those similar deals after a very, very bitter election against Uhuru Kenyatta in 2017. Kenyatta was so weak, as Dosua said, um, they probably clearly stole that election, and
mm,
that they, I think, then Raila realized that he would re-legitimize him if he contested the election. So he realized that he would actually win by not contesting it, particularly after the court thing. So Uhuru Kenyatta was
mm,
very, very weak. Uhuru Kenyatta was where Moi was in the late 90s. And then
mm,
Raila goes in there and he does the famous handshake with him. And that handshake and his influence with Uhuru Kenyatta is one of the things that drives a wedge between Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto.
yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So he goes into that now, his fifth election, and he loses it, or like he said, he's robbed. And President Ruto comes in power, and during the Gen Z protest, it becomes clear that his base and the legitimacy that he got from the election wasn't enough to counter it. So what happens? He goes into a deal with Raila. So
Mhm,
that is, people criticize him for that. They say he's opportunistic, he's unprincipled. But there are people who actually say that Kenya needs that kind of, because unlike a lot of other, you cannot be Raila's permanent enemy. He doesn't he doesn't
mhm,
he was known not to hold grudges. He's a very
mm,
amiable guy, and so he's uh, he's someone whom you can, as they say in the mafia movies, you could always do business with. So and people credit him that if he was not that kind of person, Kenya would have burnt, particularly in 2007. He was very accommodating in 2017, and they are now saying with him gone, the dynamic in
mm,
Kenyan politics has changed so much. because
Mm,
he could secure. He had a lot of influence in Kampala, particularly amongst people
mm,
in kind of the poorer parts of the city. And those were his troops, the ones whom we would call out and shut down the city. So,
mm,
Yes.
and he was very influential in Western Kenya and the coast. And he had been able to bring some of that to to help prop up and give the Ruto government strength. So this morning already,
mm.
I mean, if you talk to people, they said, look, the effect of this could be disastrous because all of a sudden, Kenya no longer has a figure who can bring polarized, polar opposites together. And they begin to think that what does this actually mean for President Ruto? And they foresee that it
I
will be
have
a
a
very turbulent
question
period. Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
I have a question here for both of you. And not to go too far away from Raila, but Nigeria also just experienced this with the death of Buhari and everyone clamoring to look like they were the closest to the man because his death leaves a huge gap in the system, right? And I want us to maybe bring this a little bit closer to me in Cameroon. Because Paul Biya and this election that is going on, Paul Biya, 92 years old, a lot of people are saying it's possibly his handlers that are helping him run the election. But what happens in Africa when strong men die? There's a fear of what could happen in Cameroon after Biya dies. But what do you think happens when strong men die, like Aurelia, who's not in power, or like a Biya who currently still is?
Well,
I'm smiling at Charles. Go ahead, Charles. You shoot first. I'll come. I'll come after.
one of the things that I saw that we see is that one, none of them has been able to see their party survive them. Uh, Obote in Uganda, all these guys, that everything that they represented, at the political level, usually dies with them. So probably, the BR party will be gone. We saw it in Uganda with the UPC. We saw it with KANU in Kenya. So the only party, strangely, which has survived is Tanzania's CCM. But the dynamics of that are slightly different, which explains it. So that is one of the things that these parties, and generally the trend we have seen is we tend to go downward from there because their hairs are usually very narrow. They're usually narrower than them. The 80s, the people who made their political bonds in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, they are able to inherit um, their political throne and their political credibility, as such. So
Mm.
we tend to see a degeneration of the politics generally, almost everywhere in Africa, and
Yes.
so it's something we need to keep an eye on.
My response to you is, Adesua, that what Raila's passing should force us as Africans to do is to debate the question of age and public office. And we should debate it regardless of whether there are, as in our case in Uganda, elections going on and so on, because sometimes some of these discussions get lost in the
Mm.
polarization of political debates. I think the bigger question is what has been the consequence of people staying till they're too old and hanging around way longer than they needed to facilitate a transition. And it's
Mm-hmm.
strange, really, that it has even come up in the case of Raila, who is not even in the state, but he obviously carried a political tradition. And now, what Charles
Yes.
has been telling us is What then happens? Could he, for instance, have prepared his constituency better for life after him? And one of the interesting two, actually, and they're interestingly both considered some of the greatest leaders in Africa. Their timing was impeccable. Julius Nyerere, Nelson Mandela. Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. They sort of had a sense that physiologically their time was up and they couldn't continue to do the job that they was required of them. In the case of Nyerere, he was probably still a bit more vital. I mean, he still had a lot more vitality, but he knew that the challenges he faced in 1985 needed a different set of leadership. And in fact, his preferred choice of successor, although he was defeated, was actually a person he thought was could have done business with the West. There was a man called Salim Ahmed Salim. So let's go across the Atlantic and see what happened in Cuba. Cuba today is disintegrating because Fidel stayed around too long. And even when he was on his deathbed, he sort of stayed around, then passed it on to his brother, who stayed around. And now they've handed it over to a group of people who have no idea what to do with the country. And it is falling apart. So I think that Africans, what Raila should, the last duty Raila has played in the public life of Africa is to force us to think in an objective, if possible, dispassionate manner. What is the effect of longevity? And what are the consequences of it when it stays around? And it's not something that we should debate, we should look at, I don't know how to put it, but it's for me, in a sense, even you could see it in the questions that people were asking. Where is Baba? Why did they have to ask? We shouldn't have missed him while he was away. It should have been obvious that there were people able to step into his shoes. And so, this fast that you point to in Cameroon, that is an unending fast till they have to bring an effigy. Then the other day, somebody reminded me that actually, by the time Mugabe in Zimbabwe died at the age of 95, he still believed he was president, although he had been out of office almost 2 or 3 years. So, so I think that as an act of patriotism, as an act
Yes.
of Pan-Africanism, as an act of responsibility to the continent, we must objectively debate the question of age, fitness, vitality, and abrupt departure. Because when you leave, especially when you've dominated with your personality an entire space, it becomes very difficult for personalities to rise up and fill the gap. It's just not possible. And by the way, in Kenya, when another figure, a colossus, Kenyatta, when he died in office, what saved Kenya was that there was a procedure and it was followed to the letter about the succession.
Mm.
So I think that yes, the question of for me, that's what Raila should force us to debate, is yes, 80, you will die very quickly. One day you're okay and you're being seen, and the next day you're gone. So what do people do? How should people prepare for that outcome?
I love this conversation that we are having because I was recently listening to a conversation around this exact same topic, but it wasn't necessarily about age. It was about the concentration of power in one man, or the consolidation of a political structure around one identity. And I was talking about America, actually, the first black mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington. And when he died in office, the whole system essentially collapsed. They could not get any of their policies or move anything forward for decades after that, because they had concentrated and consolidated the structure around one individual. And some people also challenged Barack Obama on this, in his inability to essentially build a democratic structural movement that was not embedded in himself, particularly after his first run as Hillary Clinton was just not a natural successor to an Obama. Even though we can look at how that's different, it's a different context. But I do think that in Africa, I do worry because of the type of strong man politics we play, when we also do have weak institutions or a weaker commitment to ideologies in some cases, is that all these things are entrenched about one man. It doesn't matter. It is significant that a lot of our leaders are this old, but I also think beyond their age is that their lasting legacies are not structured around anything against an individual,
Mhm.
right? And so we see that breakout, and what is scary is that in some instances that can lead to violence, right? We're hearing murmurs of certain things going on in northern Cameroon right now, and we're just hoping it does not actualize in the next 2 weeks. But when you have such fractionalization on the top, everything falls apart underneath it. And we also have to take this in the context of even Raya, even Buhari, they died in hospitals abroad.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think not just that. I mean, Raila, Buhari, African leaders are the only people that are dying in hospitals outside of the continent, not even outside of their. Well, maybe Magufuli didn't, but and Nkurunziza of Burundi, but they still this situation, which also says a lot about we leaders need to think that when people talk about providing social services, you don't have you may have your own way of running out of Uganda and going for treatment abroad. But one of the things that's not known at Desua is the humiliation of that process. The
Yes.
the applications for permissions to move these people to those hospitals, it is urgent. Then they have to sign visas, forms, and all sorts of stuff. Yet the second thing you're asking us to do at Desua is to debate: can we invest in our own locations here ability to deal with these situations? Why are we running medical tourism in India, Turkey? Not everybody can go there. Maybe specialists should be flown into here. But yes, you're right. Two African leaders in the last 1 year have died in foreign hospitals. So that I think is a legacy that one should not. But you've raised the question of violence. And Charles, one of the things that the last thing which I know Raila had to confront as a leader was the violence from Gen Z. Now, you were talking about whether
Yeah.
we should read Raila as an opportunist but our friend Mahmoud Mamdani has come up with a new phrase. He was a good weatherman. I think that he knew how to read the weather and know when to carry a raincoat, an umbrella, Wellingtons, and all of that stuff. But I think that with the Gen Z, he completely misread that movement and took the wrong side of history on that one. Because he'd just done shaking the hand of Ruto again at the farm, at the ranch of our president here in Chisozi in Uganda. And he was pursuing the AU job and all of that stuff. But Charles, contrast that with what has happened to a much younger man in Madagascar. And this were
Mm.
both of what what does that say about our politicians and how they read and manage protest? Because if there is a face of politics of protest, it is Raila. Even when he was in government, he would organize a protest against himself when he was in government. No, he was for him. Protest came naturally. He just
I'll let
his,
Charles go first.
yeah, sure. Charles, Madagascar,
No, but
interesting case
I
study
think
because all changes in government.
we are, and
Yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Andre, Rajoelina came to power, and Andre, Rajoelina came to power when he was what, 30 something. Yeah? He was
Yes, he was a radio
fairly young,
DJ.
eh? And the
Mhm.
interesting thing is, yeah, it's exactly in the same circumstances. He mobilized the youth. They, they went to protest. The army decided it would not shoot and joined them, and he became the leader. He seized power from that and became the leader. So the same guy, just barely 20 years later, he is
Mhm.
unable. He's unable. In fact, what exactly? 16 years later, he's unable
Mhm.
to understand, to read the history that brought him to power. So the protests, and they were very interesting. Initially, they were not political protests in the sense that uh, the 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 demands were political. It was just basic water,
Mhm.
electricity, and things like that. And because
Mhm.
if you have a young population who are dependent on digital and their hustles are all online, the question of power has
Mhm.
become a very, very sensitive one. So if they can't
Power,
get
you
on
mean energy?
Facebook and yeah, energy. It was basically
Yeah.
electricity.
Mm.
This electricity and water. So it becomes you and I, and some of some years back when water was and electricity was an issue, it didn't really
Mm.
matter, because there was no internet. There was that old phone sitting on the house, which didn't need electricity to work. So life
It only
was
needed
possible,
money.
but for a lot of people, yeah, it only needed money. And
Mm.
then he called out the police shot the young people. I think they killed 22 of them. And then the protest refused to, the protest grew bigger. And the young
Mm.
people really, really did incredible work and mobilization and messaging around social media. They were creating
Mm.
these videos, AI videos of Rajolina making speeches and accepting that he has been a thief, he's corrupt, and all this kind of thing. I mean, it was really very, very brilliant. And
Yeah.
then the army does the same thing. They say no,
Mhm.
Yeah.
we are not going to shoot on these people, and that was it.
Mm.
He was history. He was finished.
You know,
So what?
I want to answer, or I want to tackle Bob's question of how does the same individual not be able to read the temperature at all?
Mm.
Um, because I have seen what I have seen recently in Egypt, in Nigeria, from the stories coming out of Madagascar, even from what we saw in South Asia, just in 2 months, in a month rather, two governments have been toppled by Gen Zs, and so we have to give it to Gen Zs. They're not playing. They're not playing around.
Mhm.
But when we talk about leaders being out of touch, it my favorite word is sycophancy. They are surrounded by sycophants. I think there is actually a disease of sycophancy that's embedded in our political structure, and it's not just Africa. Because I saw what world leaders were doing with Donald Trump here in Egypt, and I could not believe it.
What
You
happened?
know, like there's a behavior that
Ah.
you see desperate men trying to get into a club, or you see girls at the end of in university trying to get into the VIP section and a concert. That is how world leaders were acting around Trump. At the point where he calls
Adesua.
out Kirsten,
Ade- Adesua,
yeah,
there's an English word for it. Can I tell you? Is it being
what
obsequious?
what does that mean?
It
That must be my new favorite word.
phoning and generally degrading yourself
Yes,
to get
yes.
acceptance. Yes, so you're being.
We saw the leader of Indonesia, talking to him about his son Eric, or caught on a hot mic moment, saying he'd like to meet Eric, and oh, he's such a lovely son. We see this like, oh, Trump has done something no one has ever done. The way he was addressing world leaders, including heads of Arab nations, like, oh, look at these rich men sitting behind me, haha, they're not used to sitting behind people, are they? And And the way that there's like, oh, he's created peace in the world that the world has never seen with this Gaza ceasefire deal that we're not even sure is an actual peace deal. But when you see that kind of behavior, you understand that people do not say the truth to these people. And I've seen it in smaller versions in Nigeria, whether it's with senators or with ministers. They are surrounded by people who can't tell them the truth, and then they watch news stations that only say good things about them, and so the reality on ground feels fake to them. That probably feels like AI. They live in such a different reality that they can no longer take the temperature of what's going on the ground. And another thing is, back to what you said, a lot of these leaders have been in power for so long that they've seen you come and go. Right? It's a lesson I learned as a student in university when we were protesting racial discrimination, and my professor just laughed and was like, "You're going to be gone in 3 years. Like, do you think you're the first to protest this?" Like, he said, we are the owners of this school. You're passing through, okay?
Yeah,
Like, you will
yeah.
deal with all the other black students dealt with before. And I feel like our leaders also have that idea of, like, they are no longer just leaders, they're institutions in and of themselves. And so
Mm.
they just see you as a passing, like a fade,
Right.
like you have your time, the other activist will have his time, you guys will all come and go, but I will remain. And so it's not, for me, it's not strange that they get there and then they become like so disassociated from reality.
And on that, I really want to just follow up with Charles with respect to Raila, because Raila, even with his status, both continental and local, even when he was in office, I would like to believe the little that I knew about him, he struck me as someone who somehow maintained his touch with the ordinary person, the guys on the street, that he never lost touch with those people. But also, as
No,
Adesua
he
talks
never.
about what the Gen Z were doing, the issue of courage, just the ability to face up to the odds and to stake a lot of things, because this guy, the family, the Odinga family had a lot of business interests, but the man never feared to place those at risk to push a political agenda. Does he, how does that lesson come through? A lesson of one, courage, but a lesson of, even as you are in high office or in high status, how do we learn from Raila Odinga how to maintain touch with your constituents in ways that, first of all, people like Andrea Rajoelina in Madagascar have failed, and the chaps in Cameroon are simply trying to do through effigies. So just take us through this Raila man. Though-
Yeah,
How was he able to
because
maintain contact? Yeah.
the but you're right, and the thing with the uh, Raila was one. He was very very much into sports. So
Ah.
yeah, so he's and but
Did he did
and
they own a football team, or they had was it Goma here?
no,
Or
no, yeah, I mean, yeah, Gor Mahia had it is base. It's very very strongly Western Kenya in terms of it is fan base, eh?
mm,
But
mm,
he would go to matches, club matches.
mhm.
These are the big people waiting to
Without
go to.
bodyguards and no fanfare.
Yeah, he would go to that.
Yeah.
So he was part of the sporting community, and that is one of
Right.
the things that kept him grounded. Really, he was just like this a bunch of Manchester or whatever Bafana guys who hung out at a local club. So a lot of his connection to the people came from soaking in that that the sports culture. I remember there
Mhm,
was in I think it was during the 2017 campaign. He goes to
mm,
make this political speech,
mm,
and Bob, he doesn't talk politics. He now
mm.
he starts chanting football. So I mean, let us
Yes.
use use the equivalent of Premier League. So he probably
Mm.
say, this one of Manchester is with the ball, he passes it to so and so, and he does this thing for like 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, as if he's a sports commentator. And
Yes.
he calls out, and he did it based on the local club scene, and then he followed with the scene as if it was a Premier League match. By the time he was finished, the crowd was hysterical. Can you imagine? He just did a football chant. So he was very, very much part of the street tradition in that sense,
Yeah.
and it helped him keep grounded. So he will be extremely missed by the footballing community. Kenya. And as long as it teaches people, I mean, you see leaders. President Kagame does a bit of that. He goes out, plays football, plays tennis, he attends matches, and and all those kinds of
Traore
stuff.
also does that.
Yeah, so there is a real opportunity there to be a platform
Mm,
by which you get much more. You are able to be connected with the things of the lives of the ordinary people and don't lose touch.
that's
So
fair.
really, we've got to wind this up. We normally wind this up by saying, what would be your good or bad event. But I think let's just make this really, really particular and talk about what would be the enduring and lasting memory of or legacy of Raila Odinga. And so while you guys think about it, I'll go first, and I'll say that for me, I think that Raila goes out at a time when his job is actually really done. I think he's done
Yeah.
his work for whatever his work was. He had finished it, and you could tell by the fact that he failed to become AU chair, misread the
Mm.
Gen Z, and then failed in South Sudan as well. And you can see that by that point, it was time up. He'd done his thing. He'd made up with Ruto, and he'd made up with with Uhuru. It is very possible that, by the way, that his passing could be another moment in Kenya for national unity, maybe a renewal, maybe a re-examination of the things that he tried to correct that could be worked on. So I feel that one, in a sense, he had finished his work and therefore we should let him go. But apart from anything else, maybe his passing could force us, both those in Kenya and on the continent, to reflect on some powerful things.
Yeah, I
Well,
think I'll go next so that Charles can close us out.
Yeah.
okay.
For me as a Nigerian, my parting shot today is interesting because what my parting shot was going to be is kind of related to what this is. As a Nigerian, I'm the only black person I've seen since I came to Sharm el Sheikh, except for the person who came here at the same time as me. But I have heard Nigerian music every single day. And I think when I think about a Raila Odinga, I think about Pan Africanism, I think about shared culture, shared identity, and in an era where we're dealing with maybe some xenophobia, maybe not a realization of this idea of the real pan-africanism, of the AFCTA, of a lot of things that are supposed to join us together. I appreciate the legacy of Raila Odinga, someone who reached across the continent. I really, really appreciate that. Somebody who really lived this ideal of me and you, African brothers and sisters, we're one. And I think that is an important part of his legacy. So for me, that's my parting shot. Us here on the Bad Natives, anyone listening, is that we really need to collaborate to see each other as one family and work towards that. These goals that our leaders like Raria, who are now passing, really believed in.
And I guess, as we sort of wait for Charles to come back because he just dropped off abruptly, the, so to let people know that that's the reason we do the Bad Natives, because then it's a Pan-African platform where we get views from across the continent. So Charles, you take it away
Sorry,
last.
yeah, sorry, kind of. I think I had an African
You
moment there.
pressed the wrong.
No, no,
Yeah,
no. I think it's just
the witch,
you know
the witch
there
doctors
is
came in.
there is there's a huge book by Raila. It's called Flame of Freedom, and which he worked on with I think one of the most brilliant journalists to work in this region called Sarah Alderkin. And my view is that no book has ever described the realities of what Cold War Africa is like that book. I think it is the definitive work, which is very interesting because I think that he meant it. I don't know whether he meant it that way or because of the effect of Sarah Alderkin, but he used his life to tell that story. So, there are things like how, for example, he ended up in East Germany. He was he couldn't be given a Kenyan passport because he was radical. So he then goes with a bunch of guys to Tanzania. They are gathered in a in a matatu. They are taken to State House. They are given a passport by Tanzania. So when the guy goes to study, he's actually went on a Tanzanian passport. So his family met him at the airport when he was flying in from Tanzania and in transit to say goodbye. Because now they couldn't stop him, he was a Tanzanian. And they all go and gather in Cairo. So there are these nearly 100 plus students who are gathered in Cairo, and Gamal Abdel Nasser shows up, and he gives them, now he tells them where they're going to study. When they reach Cairo, none of them knew where they were going to study. So then Nasser says, you are going to Cuba, you are going to East Germany, you are, and that's how they knew where they were going. So it's an incredible story about Cold War East Africa. And if you really think of it, it's that how much of that he embodied, and very very critical and a definitive part of our history. And maybe he travel where he's going well.
Amen. And with that, just to remind you, follow, subscribe for the Bad Natives if you want us to keep bringing these conversations to you.